Hi folks. This week we're going to be looking at culture and how it can affect learning in schools especially. And I thought since there isn't a chapter on culture in your textbook that it might be useful to talk a little bit about what a culture is, how it works, and how it can affect learning before we get into the various assignments you'll be reading and stuff like that. So here's one definition of culture. A culture is a self-identified group of people with shared beliefs and customs and values and language and knowledge, roles, technology, history, etc., etc. In other words, people who share what Vygotsky would call cultural tools. And an important piece of this definition is that a culture is usually considered to be a self-identified group of people, a group of people who themselves identify together as members of that culture, which is one of the big arguments against people who talk about a culture of poverty, like Ruby Payne and folks like that, because nobody self-identifies with a culture of poverty. Nobody says, oh yeah, I want to be one of those poor people. So typically when we study cultures, we assume that people within the culture are the people who get to define the culture. And the idea of the cultural tools, all of these cultural tools, the beliefs, the customs, the technology, the knowledge, the history, the language, are used to solve basic problems that are common to all human cultures throughout history. And again, I've got a list of 5 problems here, 5 questions that cultures answer using these cultural tools. The first one is, how shall we survive? That's probably the immediate and key question for all human cultures. How do we get food? How do we get shelter? How do we get water? How do we keep safe from our enemies? And different cultures have developed different customs and different knowledge and different technology and have a different history of how they do all of these things. A second really important question in almost all cultures is, how should people within the culture relate to each other? What are the norms of behavior? How do we talk with each other? What are the status relationships within a culture? And how strong are the status borders? So that in some cultures, for example, the traditional Oriental cultures, the differences between high status and low status are very clearly defined. And people address other people who are higher in status, like parents or bosses, in a very different way, and these rules are kind of formalized. Everybody knows them. In the US culture, on the other hand, and this very often puzzles Oriental students who come here, kids may call adults by their first names. Employees may call bosses by their first names. There are still status differences in how we talk to each other and how we relate to each other, but they're very much more muted and the borders aren't nearly as clear. It's hard to tell. So that's just one of the things. How do men talk to women? How do parents talk to children? How do friends talk to each other? In France, it's very common for friends of the same gender to walk arm in arm with their arms about each other's waists, or at least I understand that used to be common. I haven't been in France, but that's what I have heard. Whereas in America, that would be considered an indication of a different sexual orientation by most people. So again, things are different in different cultures. Another big question that most cultures address is, what is life for? What is considered valuable or desirable or important or right? And a corollary question to that is, how do we distribute scarce valuables? And valuables are almost by definition scarce. In fact, something often becomes valuable just because it is scarce. And this is the case, for example, with diamonds in our culture. Diamonds are really not a very rare type of a mineral. But De Beers, who owns the diamond concessions in most of Africa, is very careful about how many diamonds they allow on the market in one time so that they keep the value up, so that they remain scarce and therefore valuable. So different cultures decide who gets scarce valuables and what's considered valuable in different ways. For example, if we go maybe 300 or 400 years back in our US and English heritage culture, and most European cultures, what was valuable was land. And land was basically distributed based on who your family was. If you were born into a landed family, a member of what they used to call the landed gentry, then you inherited the land, if you were male, from your parents. And so land tended to stay in the same families, and the same families lived in the same place. And that is still the case in England. There are noble families that own whole towns, and everybody in the town rents their land from them. Whereas in the United States, we have tended to distribute scarce valuables much more based on money rather than land, and money is the thing that's considered valuable. So there are very, very wealthy people who don't own acres and acres and acres of land. There are some who do, but many don't. And although it does very much matter in this country what family you were born into, for example, Mr. George W. Bush attended Harvard as a C student. Not very many people who are C students get into Harvard, but because of the family he was in, he got in. So it does matter what family you're born into in this country, but there's a lot more that's based on your own personal earnings. So we have CEOs who came from distinctly middle-class families who are making millions now. And in our country, a lot more is based on your earnings than your inheritance. So how do we distribute scarce valuables? Another question that really impinges on what we're studying, education, is how shall we raise the young? Again, different cultures have very different ideas about how to raise the young. In some cultures that still exist in the world today, but certainly existed maybe 100 years ago, young people were considered adult at 13 or 14. Girls very often married at 14. Now we don't consider that an appropriate way to raise young people. We have young people probably in the longest period of schooling that's ever been in the history of cultures, whereas in previous cultures, many, many young people would not even go to a formal school. They would be apprenticed out. We had different ideas about how to raise young people. And finally, a question all cultures have to address is how do you deal with people outside the culture? There are smaller tribes that have been studied where anybody outside the culture is an enemy, and none of the rules apply to those people. In our own culture today, one of the big questions in the Republican presidential debates, for example, is how do we deal with people in this country who are not citizens, either people who entered legally or people who entered without legal permission? How do we deal with people who are outside the culture, and who is outside the culture? Who is defined as an outsider or an insider? These are all questions that cultures handle differently. So, how does culture affect your learning in a school? Well, obviously a whole lot of ways, and probably the biggest way is depending on what cultures you grew up in, you have different prior knowledge and experiences. And it can go from very important things like a child brought up in a city, an urban landscape, knows certain things, and a child brought up in a very rural area knows different things. And even today in the United States, you will find kids who have been brought up in very rural areas, maybe in Appalachia, for example, who have no computer access, are not familiar at all with the use of computers. And obviously this kid is in a very different position when he's trying to learn how to use a computer or to learn using a computer than the kid who was brought up, whose parents had 2 computers in the home, one for the kids, and everybody's got an iPhone, and people have tablets, and that's a very different kind of knowledge. On the other hand, a city kid who is reading something, is studying in science about plants growing or breeding animals or something, is at a very great disadvantage to the child who grew up on a farm and who knows about all that stuff. So different prior knowledge and experiences from different cultures certainly affect how you learn in schools. Another real big effect is communication and behavioral norms and styles, and this includes, of course, dialects and language differences, but it doesn't have to be dialects and language differences. And I'll tell you an example of a story from my own son's educational history. We moved down here when he was 8 years old and going into third grade. And before that, he had lived his whole life in the North, in Wisconsin and Michigan. And I also, and my husband had also lived up there. So we were all brand new Southerners, and we didn't know the cultural norms for a lot of things. And one of the norms really got him in trouble his second week in third grade. His teacher asked him a question, and he answered, yeah. Well, in the North, saying yeah is perfectly okay. But in the South, it's considered really rude. And his teacher was very offended and said to him, yes, what, young man? And my son looked at her and said, yes, I will. And he got sent to the principal because she assumed that he knew that cultural norm, that he should be saying yes, ma'am. And he didn't know it at all. So he got in trouble because of a mismatch between the communication styles of his teacher and himself. And this happens to students over and over. They're too loud, they're too soft, they don't raise their hand, they don't talk in class. There are kids who come from cultural backgrounds where children are seen and not heard. So if you're coming from that kind of a background, it's really hard to participate in a group discussion. And then, of course, there are larger differences with dialects and languages. African American English that's used by many, certainly not all African American kids, but by many, and of course Spanish, are very far away from formal written English. The English spoken by most white middle class kids informally is not formal written English either. Nobody really talks formal written English. People don't talk using formal dialects. We write with them. And if you need to think about this, think about the last time that, for example, you're in your dorm room with your roommate, or you're with your family or something, and there's someone in the bathroom and you knock on the door, and the people in the bathroom always say, who is it? I always wonder about that. I mean, do they think you're going to say it's Jack the Ripper? I don't know. But people always say, who is it? And you don't answer, it is I, which is formally correct. You say, it's me, which is correct for that situation. Formal English is not correct in informal situations. However, white middle class English is much closer to formal English, formal written English, than many minority dialects, and certainly closer than Spanish. So kids who grow up speaking a dialect that's closer to formal English have an easier time learning to read and learning to write formal English. Another difference we often don't think about is expectations and values and goals. And different cultures, again, have very different ideas about what's valuable, what's expected. One of the things that often trips up cultural minority students who are first in their family to go to college is that most cultural minorities in this country place a much higher value on family and not as high a value on formal education as they do on family. So whereas a white student whose grandmother dies, for example, in college, and I've seen this happen at UGA quite often, a white kid will go home for the funeral, maybe stay home a few days, grandma died, and then they'll come back to school. And they'll be sad, but it won't be, nobody will even consider that they shouldn't come back to school. Whereas someone from an African American or Hispanic or Native American family, if their grandmother or grandfather dies, they may go home and stay home for 4, 5, 6 weeks, maybe even the rest of the semester. Because in their culture, their obligation to stay home and maybe help the remaining spouse or grieve with the family or take some of the load off their parents who maybe have to deal with arrangements, that's a serious and important obligation, more important than finishing the semester at school. But that's something that schools, which are normally set up on sort of mainstream values, don't always understand. And you end up with the same problem with truancy in K-12 school, where a child will stay home to take care of siblings, and the school will say, you're truant. But for the family, the child's obligation to take care of their siblings is more important than going to school. Different values, different expectations. Access to resources is another really big one. And this is typically due to societal disadvantage or discrimination. For example, in the United States, 38% of African American kids live in families that earn below the federal poverty level. 38%, more than 1 in 3. And 32%, almost 1 in 3, of Hispanic American kids live in families earning below the federal poverty level. This is in comparison to only 13% of white kids. So you can see that on average, again, many cultural minority kids just simply don't have access to the resources that are available to white kids. But another type of resource that we don't always think about that's available to kids is roles, different roles. And the different roles are available for different reasons. First of all, of course, there is still discrimination. It is harder for minority people to get hired. It is harder for minority people to succeed. There are fewer minority CEOs. There are fewer minority full professors in universities. In the University of Georgia, I had 2 good friends who are African American who entered the university as assistant professors within a year of the time that I entered, and both of them failed to make tenure here. Not because, I'm here to tell you, they were every bit as good a scholar as I was, if not better. They were good teachers, but there were 2 problems. First of all, some of their colleagues did not respect their focus of scholarship, which was both of them on African American kids. They thought, that's not an important area of scholarship. And secondly, we have evidence that students here at the University of Georgia tend to give African American, especially African American faculty, but any minority faculty member, they tend to give them lower teacher ratings. And again, this is so pervasive that it's clear it has nothing to do with the actual teaching ability, but rather it's a discriminatory effect. And then there's also a question of perceived available roles. Until about 8 years ago, most African Americans would not have perceived the role of president as available to them. And that's one reason so many people were excited about the election of Mr. Obama. Whether you enjoy his politics or not, it was not until he was elected did it seem possible that a person who looked like him could be president. Right now, Hillary Clinton is trying to say that it is possible that women can be president. Up until this time, that role has not been available to women. So you have perceptions of what roles are available. And by the way, I've talked about black people and women, but the same thing happens to men. There are certain roles that are not perceived as available to them. You will see quite a few now women engineers and women athletes and things like that, but you will hardly ever see a male secretary. And that's a role that in our society is not perceived as available to men. I know a couple of male primary school teachers, one who's a kindergarten teacher, who's a simply awesome kindergarten teacher. He is one of the best I've ever seen. But he constantly struggles with people who say, well, you're a man, what are you doing teaching kindergarten? Because that's not a role that is perceived as ordinary or available to most men. And speaking of perceptions, again, culture affects students' learning by the ways in which they are perceived or responded to by other peers and teachers and other people at school. And again, we're looking at a matter of discrimination. And this is especially important if a child is perhaps a member of a culture that isn't well represented at the school, because they will be perceived as odd, as different, as not the same, as not perhaps as skilled, things like that. And discrimination is still very real, and within schools as well as the rest of society. So as we've been talking, you can see that a lot of this is about mismatches between the kids' culture and the culture of the school, the culture of the people who run the school, which typically in most schools is a white middle-class culture. Even in schools where there are perhaps a number of African American teachers. There aren't very many schools where most of the teachers are Hispanic, but there certainly are a lot of schools where maybe even the administrator, the principal, and many of the teachers are African American, but they have typically adopted white middle class kinds of cultural values in running the school, and the districts are run that way. And so children whose own cultural perceptions don't match that have a hard time adjusting to school. So a child, for example, who comes from a large family where the way to get yourself heard is to shout out your answers as fast as you can, to talk, is going to have a hard time in elementary school where they're supposed to be quiet and raise their hand. A child who's raised in a culture where children are seen and not heard, where children are not considered to be conversational partners, is going to have a real hard time joining in a discussion, a class discussion. So when the kids' values and the school's values, the kids' cultural norms and the school's cultural norms don't match, that makes it much more difficult for the child to learn. Okay, so looking at all that information, this week you're going to watch 3 very short videos about some of the interesting cultural mismatches you might not have thought about. The first 2 are kind of funny. They're just looking at things that we never think of, that we think, well, that's just normal, everybody does that. But they don't in other cultures, and I think you'll enjoy them. They're real short. And then there's a really nice short video on stereotype threat, showing how the perception of yourself as being stereotyped or discriminated can actually affect your ability to display what you know. And in testing, this is really well known, so that's going to be interesting. And then after those 3 short videos, you're going to focus on either African American challenges or Hispanic American challenges. If you choose to look at African American challenges, then here are some of the reasons for us to realize that African American kids do still face challenges in our schools, despite all the efforts that have been made by some people. 48% of African American 4th graders and 43% of 8th graders scored below the basic level in reading on the 2015 NAEPs that were just released. The NAEP is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It is the gold standard test, and they were just released a couple days ago. And so you're looking at almost half of African American 4th graders don't even reach basic level. And to really do well, you have to hit proficient level, which is 2 levels above basic, to do well in school. So that's really a problem. And in math, 35% of 4th graders, 52% of 8th graders, again, scored below basic. 13% of African American K-12 students in 2011 were suspended. 0.5% were expelled. That doesn't sound like a lot until you realize that's 1 out of every 200 African American kids were expelled in K-12. So this includes some kids who were expelled in 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade. And again in 2011, which is the latest data I could find on this, only 68% of African American students who'd started high school 4 years earlier actually graduated on time. So that means 32%, again, just about a third, are not graduating on time. So, to look at some causes of these issues, you're going to read the first 2 parts of a book, and I'm sorry, it's got the wrong date on here. It should say Lisa Delpit 2013, okay? Multiplication is for White People is her latest book. You're going to read the introduction and chapter 1 on Google Books. I bought this book just this summer. It's a good book. Lisa Delpit, you've got her picture here, is a very well-known African American scholar. She's an educational psychologist. And she's written a classic, which is one of your optionals, which is talking about teaching other people's children. She calls it The Silence Dialogue. And that's a very, very well-known article, but a lot of you probably already read it. So I thought it'd be more interesting to read one of her newest things. And you will look at her explanations for why she feels that African American children face so many challenges in schools in the U.S. today. And then you're also going to watch a video on the Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes experiment done Again, a classic, very, very well known by a teacher in the 1960s, and it has been replicated since. And she just did a 2-day experiment in her class to show the kids how being discriminated against is so damaging. And I want you to particularly pay attention to the effects on the learning of these children of just this 2-day experiment. It always stuns me when I see it. So I think you'll enjoy both of those. If you choose to focus on Hispanic Americans, here are some of the challenges that they face based on data from the Pew Trust and also from the NAEP. 45% of Hispanic fourth graders and 34% of eighth graders scored below basic again on reading on the NAEP 2015. So, and 27% and 40%, 27% of fourth graders, 40% of eighth graders respectively scored below basic in math. So these numbers aren't quite as bad as African American numbers, but they're still pretty bad. In 2013, 35% of Hispanics ages 25 and up did not have a high school diploma or its equivalent, not even a GED. And only 14% were college graduates. And one of the things you're going to look at is why that might be. And in 2013, again, the official high school dropout rate for Hispanic students was nearly 12% each year. So if you get like 12% of folks dropping out in 9th and then again in 10th and then 11th, that's a lot of kids, okay? And that's one of the highest except for Native Americans. Things you will be reading and watching. You'll be looking at an article by Jimenez, 2001. It's a Difference That Changes Us, it's called. And he is the past president of the American Educational Research Association, very well-known scholar in the area. I like his work too. You'll also be reading an article by our very own Pedro Portes and Peter Smagorinsky. Smagorinsky is from the Language and Literacy Ed department, and they're going to write about the static structures of schools that are not responding to the changing demographics of students. And then there's a video discussion on Latinos and the educational pipeline that helps to try to explain why so very few Latinos are going to school, going to college, and graduating from college. You've got several optional things. You can, of course, just look at the other group of people. There's good articles in there. There's a couple more options. In fact, there's another one that isn't even listed here. But I have given you a copy of Delpit's The Silence Dialogue article, and if you haven't read it, many of you probably have, but if you haven't read it, it's well worth reading. As I said, it is a classic in the field. And another major classic in the field is written by Asa Hilliard. You have his picture here. He was Lisa Delpit's teacher at Georgia State. He is single-handedly responsible for well over a third of the African American educational psychologist PhDs in this country. He died just a few years ago, but a third of the people who went into educational psychology who were African American, more than a third of them were his students. And he has a 1991 article called "Do We Have the Will to Educate All Children?" And I think that that's an article very much worth reading too. It's a short article, but he really brings up the question, is it that we don't know how, or we really don't care enough to do it? And then the third optional article that I didn't get listed on here is I have put in your optionals Shirley Bryce Heath's Questioning at Home and at School, which is the study that she did of kids in Tracton, and that was an African American working class community, and how they often didn't look good in school, not because they weren't smart, but because the teachers were asking questions in a different format than they ever got asked at home. And I think you'll enjoy that too. So those are your optionals, and otherwise have a good week. Thanks. Bye.